Hello and welcome to MindSight, the podcast where we explore intersections of science, communication, and human connection. I'm your host, Soujanya Kaup, and today we dive into a topic that's central to all of us, communication. And more specifically, how to communicate to truly connect. So we've received so much appreciation for our first episode on building confidence, and it was heartwarming to hear how many of you found value in it. And thank you for all the appreciation and feedback. And speaking of great communicators, we are excited to welcome back our guest from episode 1, a man who can explain quantum mechanics to a 6-year-old while making it sound like an interesting story. Venkat, welcome back to MindSight.
Thank you, Soujanya.
Now, I've been thinking quite a lot about the role of communication in human evolution, and I recently read *Sapiens* by Yuval Harari, and he says how Homo sapiens eventually conquered the world thanks to the ability to communicate. So centuries ago, a cognitive revolution rewired our brains, allowing us to describe, share, and work together in ways that no other species could. So language, he believes, started as a way to gossip and share social information. So, and it was a key in forming complex social structures that allowed us to cooperate in large numbers. So today we are going to discuss how we can use the same power of communication to build genuine connections, whether one-on-one or with an audience. So let's get started. So Venkat, let's start with individual communication. So you've had countless interactions with, say, researchers, funders, mentees, even patients in your earlier days. So how important do you think is small talk in these settings? And Harari mentions that gossip, what many of us might dismiss it as trivial small talk, was actually essential for cooperation among early humans. So how do you see the role of small talk in establishing rapport in today's world?
Frankly, I think small talk is extremely important because, in a sense, it is only through small talk that it allows people to establish individual personal connections. That said, the science of communication, if you think about it, we need to step back and think about what is the purpose of that particular communication. We need to think about it. Are you doing it to inform, to educate, to change, or to form connections? I think that's important. Second, you need to know what is the medium of communication you're using. And thirdly, all communication has got at least 3 important parts. The first part is the communicator. The second part is how you transmit that communication, the message. And the final part is the audience. Most people end up focusing only on themselves as the communicator. They forget about the transmission method. They forget about the audience. They don't think of the purpose behind communication or don't think about what the medium is. So we have to think of all of these things. So in a line, yes, gossip, small talk are all very important in terms of establishing human communication. But we also need to ask what we are specifically communicating about. What is the purpose?
Yeah, it makes sense. I think uh, how you create a space for connection, that's what finally matters most. And what do you think, when you meet someone for the first time, say, how do you balance being a professional and being someone who is a very warm person? Like, nobody wants to sound like a robo, right? But you don't want to sound like you're trying to be a best friend to someone. So how do you have a balance between these both things, being professional when you're meeting someone for the first time and being a warm person?
Yeah, I think let's use a simple example. Say I'm interviewing a student for a doctoral position or interviewing a faculty for a certain position, and we are normally assigned 20 or 30 minutes to talk to that person. So it all depends. There are some people who start with a very scripted way of interviewing. There are others who go directly to asking about somebody's CV. But my style has generally been different. I do not read that person's CV or this person's application in advance of time. What I do, I use the first 5 minutes of the conversation to really say, come on, tell me about yourself. There is nothing more important to connect with a person than asking them to talk about themselves. And it can be, and as they talk about, about themselves, the best way is to curiously ask questions. Okay, you're from Germany. Tell me which part of Germany. And if you know something about the Germany, say, I've been to this place. There's also nothing better than showing the other person that you are aware of their surroundings, you're aware of their background. I think that is always important. So that 5 minutes, I feel, is what establishes connection. And we can ask questions like, what is the book that you read last? Or tell me about, how do you find Atlanta that you've come to? Or things like that. So I think spending those first 3 to 5 minutes doing that is extremely important. And in the meanwhile, that person has also told you enough about themselves, their background, and then we can get into more interesting questions from an interview kind of sense. But the most important thing is keep the whole thing as a conversation, not like an interview, but keep it as a conversation. When you're talking to that person is talking to you. Give that person enough chances to ask you questions, and also demonstrate listening. Listening is very important. Listening is not just about listening to somebody to argue back, but listening is about really spending time to understand what that person is saying. So I think those are some of the simple principles. If you can humanize the interaction, things become very natural. And when you leave the half an hour interview, at least know something about that person. So tomorrow, if you have to introduce that person, rather than saying that this person has done this here, there, start with an important story that connects that person to their self-identity. I think that's what seems to work for me.
So being actually curious and asking genuinely to a question to know actually something about the person rather than just asking questions, and maybe active listening maybe is more important here than speaking.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of, because of a variety of things to ensure fairness, etc., people have started resorting to scripted interviews. Say, I'm going to give you 6 questions to ask. That doesn't work. And I generally don't follow that script. It doesn't work for me. I like to, when I approach somebody, I have not planned in my head what I want to ask them. And I approach them, but I want to know a few things about them. So I approach the conversation like I'm meeting a stranger. I don't know anything about their background. And as the conversation develops, I start understanding their background. And after the interview is over, I put down the microphone or the telephone or close my door, and then read their CV. And then I'm able to make the connections. That's how I normally interview people.
It's exactly like being a true scientist. I mean, having a very agnostic approach, not knowing anything about the person and starting afresh. So yeah. So, what are your thoughts on non-verbal communication? I'm sure body language, facial expression, eye contact, it all matters, and maybe it matters more than what you speak and how you speak. So, what do you think are some of the non-verbal cues or the uh, the way a person conducts himself or herself? How does it matter in gaining attention and engaging in a communication?
Yeah, absolutely important. I was reading somewhere that almost 93% or 90 or some 90 odd percent of human communication is nonverbal. Particularly in more European cultures, we have tended to overemphasize verbal communication, but I really think humans do communicate non-verbally. That's why there is a big difference between talking to somebody on a phone without a video and talking to somebody on a phone with a video. There's a very big difference between talking to somebody virtually versus talking to somebody, in person, in proximity with each other. There are many things, various forms of nonverbal communication happens. The way somebody, shows excitement, the way somebody smiles, the way somebody shows their eye movements, the way somebody, variety of things are extremely important. So even when it comes to verbal communication, there is a big component of verbal communication which is extremely important. The words we use are important, definitely important, but more than the words we use, the intonation, changing the intonation. There is nothing more boring than a monotonous voice. People that are good communicators modulate their voice and tone, appropriately. They show surprise. They show their emotions in their voice. All of that is extremely important.
Yeah, perfect. But how do you develop something like that? I mean, it's easily said, but how do you actually inculcate such things?
Yeah, my own view of this is most human beings are natural about these things. They start off being natural, but as society, we tend to condition people and inhibit them. So, I was talking about a couple of days ago to my colleague about two presidential candidates in the race for the election in the United States. One comes across as uninhibited, and in a way comes across very authentic and connects very well with his people. The other comes across as extremely practiced, extremely controlled, and is unable to make the connection. So I think that is what it is. I think in a sense, how we communicate depends on, are we coming to the forum uninhibited and with an open heart and open mind, or are we coming to the meeting with scripts and are we controlling ourselves? I think the best way to develop nonverbal communication is to take a fairly uninhibited approach to communication so that you're able to freely communicate. I think that is very important. I think communication is as much a task of the mind and emotions as it is a task of language or words. I think that is very important to know.
What I hear is be yourself, be raw, and place yourself in the open. Is that right?
I think that's absolutely correct. I think there is nothing, I think the more disarmed we are, the more we are likely to actually connect with other human beings. And that way, like somebody said, I think it was Oscar Wilde who said that being natural is the most difficult act in life. So if you're natural and if you're relaxed, then you come across, in a way that the other person is able to believe you and trust you. And B, because you're relaxed, you're able to observe the other person beyond the spoken words. So somebody might say something with words, but have meant something else, because you can see their size, you can see their bodily actions, you can see their reaction, and actually you can interpret the unspoken word. That's what is important.
Yeah, perfect. So let's move on to something I guess most of our listeners would be interested in this, delivering a great elevator pitch. So whether you're giving a project presentation, talking to your boss, or just networking with someone, elevator pitch matters. And for our listeners who don't know what's an elevator pitch is a brief but persuasive speech that outlines ideas or projects, and in a timeline which takes for you to ride an elevator. So, in a very brief time space, if you can convince a person to give you money, a funder to give you money, so that is what an pitch would mean. So, Venkat, what makes a great elevator pitch according to you?
I don't know that science of elevator pitch, but essentially, what it really means is you get a very short, time with somebody, maybe a minute or two, which is what an elevator is. So the most important thing is taking that opportunity, which means A, you've got to be uninhibited, and B, you've got to quickly reach out to that person, introduce yourself. This is me. It's wonderful to see you, and always say something nice to the other person. And then very quickly say, I'm so excited. I'm working on this important question. I think if I can answer this question, I can solve so many things, and I can probably, create the kind of thing that can save so many lives. I know what the work you do. It would be fantastic to talk to you about it. That would be a nice way of doing it. So essentially, you're introducing yourself. You're showing a level of knowledge about that person and curiosity about that person. See you're raising the excitement of the work you're doing and the potential impact you can create, and you have aroused a level of excitement and interest in the other person. If you can do that, by the time the elevator stops at whatever floor you're going to stop, you would be exchanging each other's telephone numbers or email addresses. That's what you can achieve.
So can you give us, I mean, maybe a personal story, a short one, maybe where you had to pitch an idea like this in a very short time?
Yeah, I mean, for example, let me try and think of an example. What would be a good example that come to my mind? I think on one occasion, I was in Copenhagen, and I was talking to the dean of the University of Copenhagen. So she, as we came out, she introduced me to somebody who was high up in the Novo Nordisk Foundation. I
Okay.
instantly, asked a couple of questions, introduced myself, and before we knew, I had her visiting card, and I was able to reach out to her and go and meet her in the next few days. And that's one example of a relationship that formed very naturally. There have been other such relationships.
Okay. So I guess showing excitement, connecting your work to their work, and maybe striking a balance, being concise but compelling at the same time. So that's probably the art of getting your elevator pitch right, if I've summarized
Yeah,
it correctly.
yeah, absolutely. The most important thing is not to come across as awkward or as
Okay.
aggressive. When you're awkward, you tend to come across as aggressive. And also,
Mhm.
with do it with a casualness. It's after all, it's one human being with another human being. Reduce it down to that level, human to human contact. It's not about you got to forget the fact that you're talking to somebody, so big or so small, or somebody who's senior or junior, or somebody who's famous or not famous. It doesn't matter. Humans respond to the same thing. So if you can show, if you can, and a smile is a wonderful tool to have. Those who can smile instantly disarm the other side. And so I think it's that way. It's just making that immediate connection. So, and I think you don't have to wait for somebody important to speak to. This can be our day-to-day operation. Anybody you meet, you get into a taxi, establish connection with the taxi driver. You get into a train, somebody is sitting next to you, turn around, smile, say something. That way you're making the connection, and it becomes natural. It becomes a natural part of our being. Go on a walk on a road, and you see somebody wearing a bright red shirt. You can say, "Oh, I like that bright red shirt." Say something that opens a conversation, that creates a human connection.
Fantastic. Okay. So now let's shift gears and maybe talk about communicating with large groups of, say, public speaking. And most of us, I'm sure, don't like public speaking, and we feel terrorized by even the thought of it. And it's said to be one of the uh, public speaking is supposed to be one of those fears which ranks even higher than fear of death. So maybe people prefer to be in a funeral. They prefer to be in a casket than give a eulogy. So how do you? I know that you have gone through a phase where you were not a good communicator in your earlier days, but you overcame that, and you tackled stage fear or public speaking. So, what are some of the tips, maybe what you can share with us, that how to overcome stage fear?
I think the most important thing, again, like I said, all good communication starts with the mind and management of one's own emotions. That's the starting point. So, what is it that makes one afraid of public speaking? It essentially boils down to two things. Number one, you're afraid that you're being judged. So, if you can overcome that fear of being judged, okay, I don't mind making a fool of myself. I just want to communicate, number one. If you take that sort of an approach. And secondly, one is afraid of saying the right thing. So just allow yourself to you convert the public speaking into a conversation. What would you do if you're talking to your best friend? How would you talk? So I think that way, overcoming that mental fear is the first step. The second, of course, there are certain techniques that are useful. Like, for example, it is better to start a talk or a speech or with something light-hearted or something shocking or something that will draw attention. So I think it's good that opening is important. Your opening line is extremely important. And then you want to do it in a way that you can keep the audience engaged. And this is why you need to know your audience. You know whom you're speaking to. If you're going to talk about something technical to a lay audience, you better bring it down to a level the other person understands. So always be aware of your audience and try to break down your topic into smaller bits and communicate with brevity and precision as you go along. And try to intersperse your speech by changing your tone, by pausing. Pausing is extremely important. Pausing at the right place is extremely important. And also make sure you don't lose eye contact with the audience. So you can look at the audience and try to look at the friendly faces in the audience and look at them and smile at them. That gives the audience a kind of sense of connection, and it gives you a sense of relaxation. And always finish the speech with something funny, with something interesting, with something positive, so that people remember you. It's always a question. It's a package. So you are communicating, but you're also there to give your audience a level of entertainment. So they leave the room not only knowing the facts that you're presenting, but feeling a sense of personal connection with you. That's the way good communication always happens.
Yes, fantastic. So you brought in humor. So that was exactly my next question. So how do you balance like being playing humor in your talk and managing delivering the message what you want to give with all the seriousness? So how do you strike a balance between introducing humor but not undermining the seriousness of the message what you are going to
Yeah.
deliver?
Yeah, I think humor can be very important, but if it's not done well, it can actually backfire. That's very important to remember. But a level of humor connects you. Humor allows you to make a connection with the audience. There's nothing better than getting an audience laughing. Number one. Second, you are able to convey a difficult message in a way that people will listen. Okay, it is much more easier, conveying something that is awkward through in an indirect way, either through humor or through a quote or through a poem, than directly. So I think one needs to think about how to use humor, and sometimes it comes naturally. Sometimes you have to plan for it. Like for example, I was recently talking to somebody about who had been a priest, and about the how religions tend to be highly reverent. So I said, of course, religions tend to worship reverence. Science tends to worship irreverence. For example, my opponent, when he was a chaplain, was Reverend X. So I think that becomes everybody laughs. So I think you need to do some. You need to come up with a way of doing it, and there's always an opportunity for humor when you keep looking for it.
Yeah. Yeah, I did read somewhere like humor is like a parachute and it will help you if the talk is crashing, but you need to know when to pull the cord.
Exactly. I mean, like for example, another example that I remember of humor is I was many years ago. I was visiting Taiwan for a big conference. The topic of my conference was gene environment interaction in diabetes. The day
Mhm.
before the meeting, my host took me out, to the Chinese museum in Taiwan, and I think it was the third floor. When I walked on the third floor, the entire floor was dedicated to Buddhism in China and Taiwan. What
Mhm.
impressed me was the earliest Buddha in the exhibition, which is back to 300 or 400 AD, looked very Indian. But as the centuries went by, the statues started looking more and more Chinese. So by about 700, 800, 900 AD, the statues of Buddha in Taiwan and China was beginning to resemble a Chinese person. So I took
Mhm.
pictures of this. So I began my talk by talking about how wonderful a day I had yesterday, thanks to my hosts. And then I conveyed what I knew about Taiwan. I showed a bunch of pictures about what I saw about Buddha, and I said, here is an example of gene environment interaction. The crowd was roaring with laughter, and afterwards, it was easy for me to have them listen to my scientific presentation.
So you you caught their attention right in the beginning.
Yeah. And those opportunities, like, you cannot plan them. You need to be looking for it. It is there in the environment. It is there. It happens as you're walking, as you meet somebody, you get an idea. Very often, I can say that for most of my talks, my opening sentence is something that I get during the last few minutes just before I go on stage. It's either before I've shaken hands with somebody, they've told me something that is very interesting, or something prompts you. You just go there. The opening part is something I don't prepare well ahead of time, but something happens that I'm able to, come up with.
Being an active listener helps.
Yeah, listening, and it also helps. The other thing that helps is, it is, suppose, say you're the third speaker, on the day in the day. If you open with a connection to the first two speakers, or some questions in the audience, it shows you have been engaged. You have conveyed that you have been listening, and you have made a connection to something. You're creating continuity. I think creating continuity is very, very important.
Yes, yes. And you did say that know your audience. Like I've heard this a number of times. But my question is, when you're speaking to a new group and there is a diverse group of people, how do you actually know at what level each person is, and how do you talk to a diverse group of people where some are experts, some are just novices, and you want to address at the same time, and you have a short time span to give your talk. So how do you address that?
Yeah, this is an extremely important question. I think first, if one is getting invited to a talk, to give a talk, one can ask the organizer, how many people will be there, what kind of people are you inviting? So that information is always useful. The other, say, suppose you just turn up at a place to give a talk. Hopefully, there will be some time before the talk begins, and you're able to meet a few people and just, hello, I'm Venkat, what's your name? So you've kind of picked up a few people in the audience, you begin to get an idea. So try to get some intelligent idea about who's in the audience. I think that helps. But regardless, I always feel if you can speak in a way or write in a way that anybody can understand, you have succeeded. Like somebody once said, if you can explain a very complex subject to a young person or somebody who doesn't know the field, it means that you have understood the subject thoroughly well. So that is the art of simplifying your communication. Doesn't mean you have to be non-technical. You can start off by saying, let me now explain. So you're an ophthalmologist, for example. Let me explain what a cataract is. The lens of the eye, which is so important, like in a camera, accumulates whatever, and explain it. Just explain what a cataract is, and then get on to the text. So bring everybody to the same level playing field, and then talk about the more details.
Okay, okay. So, when you're giving a talk and when you're looking at your audience, you're trying to gauge their engagement in real time, right? And when you know when you have to switch gears, you have to change your maybe technique, or when you sense that they're drifting away from you.
Yeah, I think it's extremely important. I think, this is why it's important when you're speaking to be watching your audience. So it's good to be moving your head around, moving your eyes around, so that you're seeing several people in the audience. And you can judge where people are enjoying it. Are they getting bored? Are they showing curiosity? I think so. It is, this is why I think a good speech is actually a two-way thing. You may be speaking, but you're also observing and listening to the body cues that come to you. It's extremely important to pay attention to it. And if you think the audience is beginning to, doze, that's the time you may have to say something funny or say something shocking just to bring them back, or if they show kind of a facial expression that they're not able to understand something, reach out to them. I said, I see you. I see you looking puzzled. Can I explain this better? So try to engage with the audience. If you see good actors, that's what they do. Even when you go to the Globe Theatre in England, in London, when you see the Shakespearean actors, they often try to engage the audience, even without the audience knowing it. That's an extremely important skill to have.
Yes, yes. And when you said about people dozing off, I got reminded of scientific writing for some reason. For some reason, scientific writing has a reputation for being well dry, and maybe some call it as a cure for insomnia. But I know you write so well. So, what's your approach in making things simpler? How do you explain a complex idea clearly without putting a reader to sleep?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good question. I mean, with all writing, whether it's a scientific writing or it's constructing an email or writing, casual writing, my approach has always been, and it may work for me, it might not work for others, has always been to think about it in my head a lot. So when I get pen on paper, I am pretty much writing a close to final draft. After that, it's a matter of polishing it. So I never, take pen and paper together or sit in front of a computer or a typewriter trying to write until I've already thought about it in my head. So in my mind, those things I've thought about it, and I've constructed the argument, the logic, the flow, the starting, the ending. I have a rough idea. And then when I sit down in front of a computer, it's really a mechanical process of writing. So that part for me is very, very fast. So, but the period, the gestation period, the thinking period is much longer, and that happens over long periods of time. That's why, for example, when somebody says, "Can you give a talk?" or a presentation, I tend to start quite early. Not because I spend a lot of time preparing it, but I just want to put that rough structure in my head and be thinking about it. And so by the time I come to it, I've already, my mind is well prepared. And I try to apply the same rule even with scientific writing. And the most important thing about scientific writing is this one single thing. When you write for art or literature, when you write something, 10 different people can read it and they can each interpret it differently. That's the purpose of good art. You want the reader's imagination to take over, the reader's interpretation has a tremendous level of license. But in scientific communication, when you write something and 10 people read it, every one of those 10 people should get the same message. So, what that means is that the responsibility is on the writer to keep things as precise as possible. So, using short sentences so that there's not too many clauses and subclauses. If you want to say 3 points, divide it into 3 points and 3 short sentences, like something like how Ernest Hemingway would write. One of the famous things that he said was write drunk, edit sober. When you think about it, it's a beautiful way of saying it. So write your sentences short, keep them to 1 point at a time, and make sure the words that you use are the simplest words you can use for that particular situation, and anybody reading it would get the same message. Sometimes where you place the comma, where you say the grammar can change the meaning. So you've got to pay a great deal of attention to that. So that is the way in which you write good scientific writing. And there is a joy to it. And often it is better to write drunk, just write it out, and then leave it for a day or 2 days before you edit it. And then make sure you show it to a few people, let them read it, and if they are not able to understand, you try to correct it. So I think it's an iterative process, but I always feel the part of thinking about what you're writing, up front is very important. A good structure is important. How you start is very extremely important. The first 2 or 3 lines are extremely important. Writing short sentences, using precise words but simple words, extremely important. And then making sure you read it not the same day but a few days later, so that you're able to make sure that, and you want to read it like an external reader, not like you're reading it yourself. You can say, okay, let me imagine my daughter's reading it, or let me imagine my colleague is reading it. What will they understand from this? And then always get somebody outside to read it once or twice. I think that's a way to develop scientific writing.
That's a great insight. So
And
before
also,
we
if I may add, the best writers tend to be good readers. So if you want to write good science, read good journal articles, maybe one or two a week or one or two a month, but read it not just to glean information, but read it to understand the structure of good writing, understand the structure of good presentation, understand the structure of good scientific logic. So I think that way, when you read other people's work and you try to think for yourself, your writing improves. Good writers are generally good readers, and good writers are generally people who are very clear about their ideas in their head.
Perfect. And I know you are a voracious reader. And I wanted to know, like, what are the maybe say top 3 or 5 books which you would recommend that everyone should read by the age of say any age? I mean, no age limit.
Oh, but this is a very hard question because it all depends on what you're reading for. I generally feel that our reading should be a combination of a few types of writing. I mean, definitely there's place for nonfiction, there's place for poetry, and there's place for classics. Personally, I feel reading a few pages of classical literature is always good. The reason that is good is you enjoy classical literature only by reading it slowly. And
Name a
that's,
few.
pardon?
You could name a few, maybe like your topmost choice in each
Yeah,
of
my
these.
topmost choice for what would it be? I happen to have liked Anna Karenina, for example. I happen to have liked, Yuval Harari's *Sapiens*.
Yes.
I happen to very much, just reading, William Dalrymple's, the Golden Road. I've enjoyed a number of different books. I've enjoyed biographies. I enjoyed the biography of Gandhi a lot. I enjoyed Nelson Mandela's autobiography. I've enjoyed Martin Luther King's writings. I've enjoyed essays of Bertrand Russell. So a number of that. But overall, I feel it's good to read some amount of classical literature, some amount of poetry, because it gives you mental balance and it gives you a level of empathy. And it's also important to read non-fiction. So I think it's a lot of things. It's difficult to give a list of books that people must
Quite
read.
a lot. Yes, definitely.
Yeah, yeah.
Perfect. So, Venkat, it's always a pleasure speaking with you, and thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today. And we have explored so many things today, from small talk to scientific writing, and I'm sure each one of us listening to you have learned something. And that brings us to the end of this episode of MindSight. And remember, communication is not just about words; it's about connecting. So until next time, keep communicating, keep connecting, and keep growing.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.